This is Mauro Prosperi, and he's about to make a horrifying mistake. He's running an ultramarathon in the middle of the most remote desert on the planet. And shortly after this photo was taken, he's gonna take a wrong turn and he's gonna run a whopping 180 miles in the wrong direction. And so needless to say, Mauro is screwed. What followed this mistake was a story so morbid that it probably shouldn't even be on YouTube. A story so baffling that experts struggle to explain it even to this day. But before we go to the sandy dunes of Africa, we need to start in Italy, more specifically Rome, the birthplace of the Colosseum, pasta carbonara, and Mauro Prosperi. Born in 1955, Mauro basically started running as soon as he possibly could. He was one of those kids who would just tear off from his parents, climbing trees, weaving through city streets, going as far as his little legs would take him, right? And even though he was a bit wiry as a kid, he had the heart of an athlete, and he knew that one day he would be defined as one. However, after graduating high school, Mauro joined the Italian police force in the crowd control unit. But he didn't join because he liked rules or authority or anything that normally comes with being a police officer. He joined because the uniform invited the opportunity for competition. And what I mean is that in Italy, it was very common for police officers to get involved in sports, and the leagues that these officers competed in were pretty serious. Oh, and speaking of things that are pretty serious, I'm pretty serious about hitting 1 million subscribers on this channel. And as you can see, we're getting pretty close, but we still have a decent ways to go. And so I would appreciate if you could help us out by hitting that subscribe button right now, especially if you're a repeat viewer. Mauro loved every single sport that he came across with the police force, but his favorite was quite literally the ultimate sport. I'm talking about the pentathlon, a combination of fencing, shooting, swimming, riding, and of course, running. And by the way, Mauro wasn't just good at the pentathlon, he would go on to become a decorated athlete, a 9-time champion who even represented Italy in the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. So, yeah, Mauro was kind of a beast, you could say. And it was in his training for those very same Olympics when another key part of Mauro's story came into focus. He met and fell in love with Cinzia Pagliara, who worked as a translator. Even way back then, Cinzia noted how hard Mauro worked and how willing he was to overcome obstacles. And she also noted how comfortable he was in the spotlight. Let's just say that Mauro was a fan of having fans. I mean, he was a super athlete and his ego kind of matched that persona. But after the excitement of those Olympics, Mauro's life gradually slowed down. He went from, the super athlete to, well, a stay-at-home dad. He and Cinzia had 3 kids together in those next few years, and, well, you know what tends to happen when kids come into the picture, right? Not that I have any yet, but from what I hear, it becomes a bit more difficult to put your own dreams first, and that's what happened to Mauro and to his running career. And it was in this sort of restless, I'll call it, state that Mauro reached out for advice to his friend Giovanni Manzo, a fellow running enthusiast. And that conversation would end up changing the course of Mauro's life forever, and not in the way that he could have ever thought possible. Giovanni was like Mauro. He was a super athlete with a hunger for competition. And he was sort of like that friend that doesn't really get along with your significant other, but you can't stay away from him either. So all your hangouts are kind of like a secret. Anyways, Giovanni had come across a new race that had formed just a few years earlier, and he knew that this was exactly the kind of thing that could break Mauro out of his rut. And folks, I'm talking about, of course, the Marathon des Sables, which when translated from French means the Marathon of the Sands. And look, all I'll say is that if regular marathons already make people question their life choices, well, this particular ultramarathon makes people question physics, literally. It started in 1986, 2 years after a Frenchman named Patrick Bauer decided to trek across the Sahara Desert alone, and he thought, this would make a great group activity. And I'm obviously editorializing a little bit there, but Patrick Bauer did see it as an opportunity to bring together the world's most superhuman athletes for a test of true endurance, right? Because, you weren't just running through the desert, but you were also sleeping in it. And this probably goes without saying, but just in case you don't know, The Sahara Desert is literally the definition of extreme, with some of the hottest days on records and still nights that get below freezing somehow. And so Giovanni told Mauro all of this, and Mauro was in, without any consultation with anyone, including his wife, Cinzia. Mauro started his training by running 25 miles, or around 40 kilometers, every single day, which is insane. I mean, that's pretty much running a normal marathon every 24 hours. And to prepare for the desert conditions, he would drink less and less water during these training runs, basically getting his organs used to being dehydrated. In just a few short months, Mauro had shred any remnants of his dad bod and was in Olympic level shape once again. And once he had studied the maps and created a ration plan, he felt truly ready for the Marathon des Sables. And folks, a lot of this stuff happened really fast. Mauro registered for the race, he booked his flight, he did the training, and then he purchased the gear that he needed. There was only one thing that was missing, and that was his wife's approval. Cinzia, again, understandably, was extremely worried. She knew that the man she married was always going to be an adventurer, right? And that even 3 kids wouldn't stop him from wanting to be a super athlete. And I want to be clear, it's not like she was actively trying to stop him either, but like, this entire time, she was just genuinely worried about her husband's safety. I mean, at 38 years old, Mauro wasn't exactly a spring chicken anymore. And despite all of this intense worry, Cinzia couldn't have possibly known just how dark things were going to get for Mauro when he actually did this race. And I gotta say, one of the things that gets me through telling these dark stories every single week is when I get to kind of pause and lift the mood for a little bit, even if it's just for a moment. And so, without further ado, I'm gonna try and probably fail at making you laugh while I tell you about AG1. That's right, this video is sponsored by AG1, the daily health drink that somehow makes me feel like I've got my life together, even if my laundry situation says otherwise. AG1 Next Gen combines your multivitamin, pre and probiotics, plus superfoods and antioxidants, all in one simple scoop. I mix it with cold water every single morning, and it's basically like replacing a shelf full of supplements with just one simple drink. And if you've ever tried keeping track of like 15 different pills before you've even had your coffee, well, you know how big of a win that really is. It's got over 75 That was so dramatic. 75! It's got over 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. It's clinically backed, and it's NSF certified for sport, which means that the quality is actually tested. You know, not just like my cousin says it's fine, tested. AG1 supports energy, gut health, and immune function, and it's made to be simple, right? No complicated routines or weird timing, just one scoop, one shake, and you're done. It's quick, it's easy, and it makes me feel like I'm at least trying to be a responsible adult. And right now, AG1 has an absolutely insane deal for you, aka my audience. Click the link at the top of the description or scan the QR code on screen right now, or I guess it's right there actually, my bad. Click the link or scan it and you will get a free welcome kit, including a bottle of vitamin D and free AG1 travel packs when you first subscribe. That is a lot of freebies, and so one more time, click the link or scan the QR code and you'll also be supporting the channel in the process, so I appreciate it very much. Okay, hopefully I made you laugh there. I probably didn't, but regardless, let's now get back to this crazy story. Despite his wife's massive concerns, Mauro assured Cinzia that he would be fine during the race and that he would return in just over 2 weeks, not just in one piece, but with a trophy. Because of course, Mauro was a competitor. He wasn't just running this race for fun, he wanted to win it. And so when he kissed his wife and children goodbye, Mauro was only focused on one thing, and that was the finish line. And it was this singular focus that might have been the first sign of the disaster that was about to come. On April 10th, 1994, about 80 runners lined up on the edge of Morocco with the endless sands of the Sahara rippling in the heat ahead of them. News helicopters buzzed overhead, reporters snapped photos, and Mauro Prosperi looked sharp, calm, and confident. Again, he wasn't just there to survive, he was there to compete and to win. After Mauro had left, Cinzia hadn't really heard much from him other than, just brief messages that he was safe and he was prepared. And she hadn't heard anything from the event organizers either. But the Italian newspapers were covering the event, and so Cinzia knew that today was the day that Mauro was about to set off into the desert. On that starting gun, Mauro and the other racers took off. Just like in his training, he would be running about the length of a normal marathon every single day in the dry heat of the Sahara Desert before eventually crawling into a sleeping bag and trying to rest in sub-freezing temperatures. And for the first 3 days, Mauro was crushing it. He was finishing on top of the leaderboard, essentially, in the top 10 runners every single day. He had no cramps, no health issues to speak of whatsoever. And each night, he'd tape his blisters, he'd eat freeze-dried meals, while he chatted up the other runners, often late into the night. According to those runners, Mauro had the personality of a celebrity, a very outgoing guy. But the thing is, this marathon wasn't about personality or even about making friends. It was all about endurance and awareness of your surroundings. Mauro may have been in the best physical shape of his life, but it's definitely possible, even probable, that he started to lose track of the mental part. On the 4th day of the race, the morning started as usual with the runners rising early, loading up their backpacks, and beginning their trek/run across the desert. But on this particular day, Mauro was even more determined than usual. His goal was to improve his positioning no matter what. And so he started to pull away from the pack at the very beginning of the day, realizing that he could cut across small sand dunes and create distance from the other competitors. But as the day went on, a few runners started to notice that the air was almost shimmering in front of them. And maybe this was just a symptom of dehydration or something like that, but it wasn't long until the horizon in front of them turned brown. When they noticed this, all of the runners knew what was happening, and it was something that they had actually been warned about. A Sahara-sized sandstorm was moving in. An endless wall of fast-moving wind and dark sand blew across the marathon competitors. And I've never been in anything like this, but from what I researched, trying to actually run through it would have felt like running inside a hairdryer full of razors with absolutely zero visibility. I don't know how else to say it. Obviously doesn't sound very pleasant, and so many of the runners followed the safety instructions that they had been given in case of an event like this. They dropped to the ground, they curled under their emergency blankets, and they waited. A sandstorm like this could last for hours, and there was no sign of this one stopping anytime soon. But, as I told you, one of the runners was only focused on the finish line and nothing else. And that, of course, was Mauro. And so as his fellow competitors paused their race, he saw an opportunity to keep going ahead, cutting through the dunes and creating more and more distance between him and the rest of his competitors. And so, despite the stinging sand and overwhelming darkness around him, Mauro kept going, running into the wind for 8 straight hours. Well, actually, I shouldn't say straight. When the storm finally cleared, Mauro, for the first time, looked around and he didn't see anyone else. And so at first, he thought that his plan had worked. I mean, it was brilliant, right? He thought that he had gained real ground on the rest of the runners, and even though he had sustained a nosebleed, I mean, hey, it was worth it, right? But as he waited and waited, it became more clear that he hadn't taken a straight path through the desert. He hadn't followed the correct course. There was no runner, checkpoint, or landmark at all within eyesight. It was just Mauro, alone, and miles of shifting dunes stretching on forever. And folks, this is where Mauro's story goes completely off the map. Mauro checked his compass, but that wasn't going to help very much in the middle of the desert like this. And so he kind of just started jogging in one direction, thinking he would eventually reconnect with the course or see one of the large flags in the distance that marked a checkpoint or something. Hours passed. The sun blared overhead like a spotlight on Mauro, and for the first time, maybe in his entire life, he started to feel some real fear. It was becoming clear that, at least for today, he was lost and no one was going to be coming to save him. That night, he would end up collapsing out of exhaustion. And since he wasn't carrying his sleeping bag, that was waiting for him at the next checkpoint. Mauro dug a shallow hole in the sand for warmth, and he wrapped his emergency blanket around his body. I mean, that's all he could do, right? He tried to stay calm, knowing that in the pitch black, there was pretty much nothing else he could do but just rest and wait for rescue in the morning. And to be fair, when morning did eventually come, it started off with the best possible sign. And that, of course, was the sound of whirling blades in the distance. That's right, a helicopter had been sent out to search for Mauro. But as he fired his flare into the sky, his hope slowly drained. The helicopter pilot completely missed the flare. It was too dim compared to the desert sun, I guess. And not only did the pilot miss the flare, but he literally flew right over Mauro. And I will note that the race did upgrade their flares the year after this, but yeah, that was 1 year too late for Mauro. And so the helicopter misses him, and now he's like pissed, right? I mean, not only had he squashed any chance of winning the race at this point, but he's literally in a life or death situation. And so he resolved that he was going to have to get himself out of this no matter what it took. For 2 days and nights, he would travel further and further out into the desert, using whatever landmarks he could to try and figure out his positioning. But these landmarks always seemed to be shifting, probably because, you know, they were made out of sand. By the third day in the desert, Mauro's rations were running dangerously low. His tongue was sticking to his teeth, and he wasn't sweating anymore, which meant that he was officially dehydrated. He couldn't even eat what food he had left because he wasn't making saliva anymore. And folks, this is exactly the moment when Mauro started hallucinating. Shapes on the horizon began looking like runners. Imaginary voices were calling Mauro's name. He'd sprint towards them, and then they would just kind of disappear into nothing. And don't forget, it's about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 49 degrees Celsius. And if you're not sweating and not drinking water, a few things are happening to your body. Your blood is basically thickening, and so your heart rate speeds up. Your kidneys start to fail, and your body starts breaking down muscle in order to get enough moisture. So by night 3, Mauro was already deteriorating. And this is when his wife Cynthia finally got word of what had happened. But she didn't hear it from the event organizers, no. She heard it from the newspaper. That's right, she had to read the news that the father of her children, her husband, was missing in the Sahara Desert. I mean, she had to learn about this the same way everybody else did. And I know it was the 90s, but man, that's just shocking to me. So after a moment of horror, Cynthia had no choice but to leap into action. While she stayed at home with the kids, her brother, her brother-in-law, and some Interpol workers boarded a plane to Morocco. And because Mauro was with the police force back in Italy, they were able to recruit resources and crew from Italian and Moroccan authorities as well. But despite this effort, the odds were obviously stacked against them. And honestly, this was probably more of a symbol of trying rather than an actual search effort, but I don't know. The reason that I say that is because the amount of Saharan desert that they had to cover was about the size of the country of New Zealand. That's right, all that territory just to find one man who was literally shrinking in size day by day. On Sunday, April 17th, the marathon finished. And while there was a celebratory banquet, for those that were there, this felt more like a memorial service. Everyone was talking about Mauro in the past tense. Patrick Bauer, the guy who kind of founded the race, even said, quote, "The spirit of the race was ruined. There was nothing to celebrate." Elsewhere in the desert, Mauro was, let's just say, in very bad shape. He had run out of water, and now his last options were sucking wet wipes and, how do I say this? Waste product? Like his waste product. But even drinking his own urine was worse than it sounded somehow, because it was getting darker and darker to the point where it was almost black. And with no real hydration, Mauro's skin was starting to flake off, exposing him to severe sunburn. And on top of that, mentally, he couldn't have been doing well either. I mean, all he'd seen for days on end at this point was sand. Lots and lots of sand, with zero hope. But on this particular Sunday, Mauro saw something else. And the first bit of actual hope that he had since this whole thing started came in an oddly appropriate place. Way off in the distance, Mauro noticed what looked like a mud brick building, and once he realized that it wasn't a mirage, he made a beeline for it. The relief of shade and an enclosed space was only temporary, but at this moment, Mauro was more interested in something else in this strange building even than his survival. He noticed religious images carved into the walls all around him. He realized that he was standing in an Islamic shrine that was hundreds of years old. It was the site of prayer for people like him, lost without hope. And so, Mauro started to cry, though of course, he was too dehydrated to actually produce tears, but he still started to cry as he thought about everything in his life besides the race. His wife Cynthia, his family, his kids, all of the things that he had put out of his mind in order to compete in the race were now all of the things that he wanted back so desperately. As the sun started to set, Mauro used some of his leftover urine to cook the remainder of his rations on a burner. And as he did this, he noticed sounds coming from a darker area of the shrine. But of course, this wasn't people. It was the sound of small pairs of wings beginning to flutter. There were bats on the roof. And in this moment, Mauro went into full-on survival mode. He did something that he didn't know he was even capable of, swooping a bat out of the air. And once he had it in his hands, he did another thing he probably thought he'd never be capable of. He cut the bat open and he sucked out its blood. Shout out Ozzy Osbourne, rest in peace. Later that night, after he had finished his meal, Mauro also placed an Italian flag on the roof of the structure, kind of marking his place. And for the first time since all of this began, he actually slept, like properly slept, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was the spot where he was going to be rescued. And when he woke up in the morning, a familiar, hopeful sound awoke him. There was a plane somewhere far off in the distance, circling around different areas of the desert, clearly searching for Mauro. And so he leapt outside and he began tracing SOS in the sand. He also lit a small fire to create a smoke signal. But just before the plane came into sight, disaster struck. Just like on race day, just like when this entire nightmare started, another sandstorm came plowing through the Sahara. Mauro prayed that it would go away in time, but this sandstorm was just huge. It lasted over 12 hours. When it did finally pass, Mauro listened for the sound of any search planes, but he heard nothing. He was right back to square one, and on this particular night, Mauro was just done. He'd had enough of the bat blood, and he was now scrounging to survive on beetles, rotten dates, and even bird droppings. He had fought so hard up to this point, but it sucks to say he was kind of losing the will to live. He carved a message into the wall of the shrine using some leftover charcoal from his burner, and he wrote, quote, "I hope you will forgive me. I love you, Cynthia." After doing this, Mauro prepared himself a bit of a ceremony. He took his race bib and he set it beside him almost like a gravestone. He took his shoes off, revealing heat blisters that had broken the soles of his feet. And this next part's a little graphic. I'll try not to get too bad, but it kind of illustrates where Mauro was at this point. Basically, he tried to, he tried to end his life with the idea that he'd, bleed out, essentially. But he had to stop, and not because of fear or regret, but because the blood was literally not coming out of him. He was so dehydrated that he couldn't even bleed out, which I'm no doctor or expert on the human body, but that's something I've never even heard of. That's insane. And so, because he couldn't even take his own life at this point, as the sun rose over the Saharan desert, he was faced with two choices. He could either sit in the shrine and wither away on bat blood and bird crap, or he could keep walking. I'll give you a second to guess which option he chose. This particular moment was also right around the time when Cynthia, back in Rome with their children, was given an update from the search party, and it was a grim one. There was still no sign of Mauro, And the Moroccans had never heard of anyone surviving more than 4 days in the Sahara Desert without water, and so it was basically a foregone conclusion that Mauro had died. But fortunately, Mauro himself didn't get that update. And so on day 6, he taped his shoes back to his feet, and once again, he started walking through the desert. His plan was to head northeast towards some mountains that were off in the distance, which he thought marked a town named Zagara. But he didn't really know exactly where to head, and so he kept that same mindset that he had since the beginning, which was be anywhere but where I am right now, because where I am right now, I am screwed. His vision blurred as he counted steps to stay conscious, and he called out to his wife, whose voice kept ringing in his head over and over. Going back to his days of training, Mauro stuck to a very strict routine. In the early mornings and early evenings, when it was cool, he would walk and he would hunt. At one point, he even fashioned a slingshot out of sticks and bungee cord, and he killed a mouse as well as a snake. And this, it's a little better than bad blood, I guess. It kept him fed, at least for the moment. He would also be on the hunt for any moisture he could find. And I'm not even talking about water at this point. I'm talking moisture from rocks, grasses, and of course, any urine that he was able to produce. As he wandered through the desert, he would leave behind pieces of himself, like, a t-shirt, for instance, toothpaste, tinfoil, just anything that he had with him. And actually, some of these items were found by the search party while he was still missing. They found a water bottle, a blanket, a shoelace. And yet, despite these findings, they still hadn't found Mauro. And it was still generally believed that he was dead. His wife Cynthia certainly wasn't holding out any hope, as hard as it is to say that. On day 8, Mauro stumbled upon a small puddle, which he promptly went face first into, and after puking from taking in too much water, used to refill a canister. And as he sipped on a newly filled water canister, he was convinced that the very next day, he would somehow be saved, which was very bold thinking. But hey, if I was drinking actual water after days of drinking my own urine, I'd probably feel the same way. On day 9 of this ordeal, Mauro wrapped a scarf around his face to protect himself from the elements, even though his skin was now blackened with sunburn, and he moved east with real intent, we'll say. And after a few hours, Mauro came across the very first sign of life that he had seen since before the sandstorm. This was goat poop. That's right, we've talked about urine, now we're going to talk about poop. And though I'm making a joke, this was actually insanely huge for Mauro, because he knew that goats don't survive in this ecosystem without humans. And so Mauro was now focused on finding the goat herders that he now believed were out there. He followed a few goat tracks and more poop, and eventually he was finally able to make out some very small footprints. Human footprints, I should add. This was huge, folks. And it gave him a renewed sense of energy, we'll say. And he even started running again, like he had been on day 1 of the marathon. And as he crested over a dune, he saw a girl, a nomad from the famous Blue People tribe of the Sahara. He saw this girl herding the goats whose poop he'd been following. But as soon as he cried out for help, she ran away. She was, after all, only 8 years old, and Mauro basically looked like a mummy or a zombie at this point. But he waited with the goats, and after a few minutes, the girl returned with her grandmother, one of the elders of this tribe, who beckoned Mauro to follow. He stumbled after them, and eventually he was taken into a tent by a group of women in the tribe. They gave him mint tea and goat's milk, and while he tried to eat some of the food they gave him, he couldn't even swallow at this point. Eventually, some of the men of this particular tribe were brought in to meet Mauro, and they were a little skeptical of him, you could say. Again, he looked like a burnt skeleton, and he spoke a language that they didn't recognize. It was very strange for them, and so the men loaded him up on a camel, and they brought him to the nearest village, which was several hours away. And while you might think that this is where Mauro's journey ends, a happy ending, well, he was actually arrested, like on site. And they blindfolded him as well. They treated him like he was a real threat. You know, the guy who was just days earlier drinking his own urine. Anyways, the military in this village thought that Mauro was a spy, And so he was driven to a military base, and they actually began to interrogate him. Oh, and keep in mind, Mauro was beyond delirious at this point. And so, to be fair to the people in this village, he probably did seem pretty suspicious. And the story he was telling was insane as well, like the entire story I've told you so far. You know, finding an ancient Islamic shrine, drinking bat blood, not being able to die. But then, after about an hour of interrogation, another officer burst into the room. This particular guy had put together the pieces about who this strange man actually was. And so he informed Mauro that he was currently in a place called Tindouf, which was in the country of Algeria, over 180 miles from where he disappeared in Morocco. On the evening of April 24th, after Cinzia put the kids to bed, she received a phone call. And what she heard on the other end sent her to the ground. The voice she heard was familiar, and it said, quote, "Did you have a funeral for me yet?" Mauro lost over 30 pounds. He suffered from burnt corneas, and he didn't urinate for several days. But Mauro Prosperi, whose last name translates to fortunate, was alive. And this, of course, is when the legend of this story took off like a rocket ship, as well as controversies that you could say led to some pretty bad bat blood. With a map laid out in front of him, Mauro guessed that he had traversed a mountain range called the Jebel Bani, which borders Morocco and Algeria and happens to be laced with landmines and guarded by tense military, as if his story needed any more danger. After a week of recovering in the hospital, TV crews and newspaper outlets swarmed Mauro upon his return to Italy. He laughed and he joked. He told the bat story. He showed the scars on his wrists. Mauro was comfortable in the spotlight, but not everyone was comfortable with Mauro, and not everyone was comfortable with his story because, frankly, some people weren't buying it. First, the journalists dug in. I mean, could he have really walked that far without water, surviving only on bat blood, bird droppings, and bugs? The odds of survival were obviously extremely slim, especially with the resources that Mauro said he had and the distance that he said he covered. And the journalists also wondered, how could he have crossed the Moroccan-Algerian border without being noticed by anyone? After all, the landmines were active in the area, and that meant that the border was being closely monitored. And then, even more research allegedly showed that Mauro's timeline didn't perfectly match the weather records from the time. Some people even questioned if the sandstorm that caused Mauro to get lost in the first place was even really that bad. Plus, there was no record of this shrine that was so integral to his survival. One magazine even went so far as to accuse Cinzia as being in on all of this, as she controlled the media coverage from afar. The bad blood got even worse when the organizers of the marathon accused Mauro of fraud. This was most likely because Mauro was trying to sue Patrick Bauer for a poorly marked trail. Ultimately, Mauro did drop any attempts at a lawsuit. Apparently, he was most upset that the organizers didn't call his wife. He said, quote, "My problems with Bauer weren't legal, they were personal." In 1995, however, many of these doubters were kind of put to rest. A documentary crew attempted to retrace the steps that Mauro claimed to have taken, and what they found was pretty incredible. They found the shrine matching Mauro's description, as well as his belongings and the skeletons of several bats. And as for the Marathon des Sables, which quickly improved some of its safety measures, Mauro actually decided to run it again. He didn't need to win the race this time, but he did need to scratch that itch and, finish what he had started. And actually, Mauro didn't stop at just finishing it once. He would go on to run the race a total of 9 times, the last of which being in 2017. Which is pretty insane. Nowadays, Mauro is a 70-year-old grandfather. He and Cinzia are unfortunately no longer together, which he has chalked up in the past to the demands of his lifestyle, but apparently the two do remain close. And Mauro is actually involved in other kinds of storytelling. He was actually brought in as a consultant on The Revenant, which, if you know anything about that movie, is all about survival in near impossible situations, just like Mauro's truly insane story. And so, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe he fabricated it somehow, or maybe, you know, he just didn't remember certain parts correctly. I don't know. Now look, despite some of the media coverage at the time kind of casting doubt on things, in my opinion, there's just no way that this story was truly fabricated. You know, maybe there were certain parts of it that were misremembered or exaggerated, but I mean, at the end of the day, you can't really make this stuff up. Even if Mauro was a bit, you know, camera friendly, even fame hungry, you could say, there's no way that anyone would have chosen to endure that kind of mental and physical damage, or anyone that would put their kids and their family through that kind of trauma. And plus, every report of what Mauro looked like basically compared him to a ghost, like his physical condition, right? Which of course is what 9 days in the Sahara Desert would do to pretty much anybody. Mauro didn't die. He couldn't die. And whether it was the Islamic shrine, or the memories of his family, or the bat blood, he always found a way to live another day and to run another race, which is something that I find inspiring, and honestly, the biggest reason why I wanted to tell you all this story. And so thank you for watching, and if you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel where we do stories like this every single week. And hey, YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click. I think you're gonna like this one as well.